Hello, this is the Jordan B. Peterson study group. This is our basically podcast session where we go over the previous. Let me stop looking at the camera. That's distracting me. Where we go over our discussions over the weekend. So for yesterday, we had no real main topic that we were starting in on. Except for kind of this overall topic of morality. And like originally we were intending to kind of go through and compare and contrast different types of morality that are like found around throughout philosophy and so on. But instead we kind of it ended up kind of finding out or thinking that we've found out or trying to find out the core reasons for why we have morality and how we can kind of fulfill those reasons. So starting off, we had all listened to Johnathan Haidt, and he's done many different things, even with Peterson himself. But this one particular podcast was something that we had both listened to, and he goes into a little bit on he has this metaphor, the moral taste buds for groups or people and individuals within groups. These moral taste buds are, let's see, liberty and oppression. So like he has the kind of positive aspect of the taste bud and the basically like the distaste for something. So there's certain groups or individuals that have a higher taste for having liberty and a distaste for any time they're being oppressed by anything. So the more libertarian, that's how that's kind of associated with. There's the taste for sanctity or purity, and then the distaste for degradation of things that are like holy in nature. And that's not even just religious exactly, because he brings up the social justice warrior leftist mentality. They hold certain things to be taboo that cannot be talked about, and in the same way, the right, they hold certain other core tenets to their belief system to be held in high regard. So like for more patriotic Americans to do something that would degrade or to like burning the flag, that's kind of something that would break that purity law essentially. But yeah, it's seen in many different cultures. Authority, so a taste for having a respect for authority and a distaste for subversion of that authority or that respect. So like this is closer related into the rights mentality, because they have a strong distaste for children like backtalking to their parents, or there's kind of a need to respect police, or people in positions of authority, because they have a higher amount of responsibility than you yourself do, and so it's a need to kind of show that respect or that acknowledgement of that higher amount of responsibility that a certain individual holds. And so that can be seen like within royalty and like holding or presidents or anything like that. And I mean, for each of these, there's always a good case for the antithesis for this. So like in the case of if you have somebody in authority that is not of respect, like somebody that you see as detrimental or as a bad egg or something like that, then yeah, there's a reason for why they don't have that authoritative respect. But it's very useful to know these moral taste buds, as he uses, so that we can better understand the opposing sides for what they hold be valuable, so that we can speak to them in these terms that they understand and that they desire to be had. And that goes directly into loyalty and a distaste for betrayal. So yeah, very much a trusting, between groups. And then there's a strong taste for fairness to occur and a distaste for cheating to happen. This is something that is seen definitely within both sides. But for the more leftist side, I don't want to keep on portraying these in different, like right and left, because it's something that these are types of things that are seen throughout, not just in political beliefs, but within, say, religious beliefs or philosophical or ethical beliefs that people hold, regardless of political position. And then care, a strong sense of care or desire for care, and a strong distaste for harm to happen to those that don't deserve it exactly. Like if you see a child being beaten, that instantly it like takes hold of you and affects your own disposition, because you're seeing something that is affecting those moral taste buds exactly. And I think like the metaphor isn't as strong as it should be, because tastes are very much subjective, and people like have the they're essentially just like opinions of somebody else, and so it kind of draws that idea that this person has a certain amount of taste, but that's their taste, but I have my own taste, and it doesn't really matter. But it's more so than I think taste, because it's more like needs to have. Like imagine you had a specific diet or a nutritional defect within yourself, and so you had to eat a lot more salty foods because you needed that sodium within you. So that would be a strong sense of taste for salt, but it's done as a survival mechanism. So yeah, and I think that's similar to these, because these moral tastes are very much a survival mechanism, but not necessarily for the specific genes of an individual, but more so it seems as kind of a group selective trait to be brought on, and especially when you have people within a group that contain both sides of these beliefs or these tastes. I guess I'll just use tastes still in this manner, even though it's not the ideal, because I'm not exactly sure what a better use for or a better term might be. But since Haidt uses taste, I'll go ahead and continue in that, just so it's something that we can at least kind of like picture in our minds. So yeah, those were Haidt's moral taste buds that are there that guide our moral belief systems. And so there's this also really interesting video by this YouTube channel called Coffee Break on profanity. And what he does is he kind of goes through the different levels of profanity within specific cultures. And there's different like subsections of what types of profanity there are. So there's like profanity that has to do with sex. There's profanity that has to do with your relatives and like the actions of your relatives, we'll say. And then there's profanity that has to do with disgusting things, such as poop or anything that is filthy. And then there's profanity that has to do with the like the taking of the Lord's name in vain. That's like saying using Jesus Christ as a expletive. Those types of things. And I think I think there's another one that's used very much in, I guess, more Eastern culture, which has to do with like profanity to do with death, which I don't think we necessarily have that within Western culture as well. We do have like damn, which is kind of, I see that more as the kind of religious usage. But anyway, it's very interesting watching that video and also knowing Haidt's oral taste buds, and to see how certain cultures have a higher sense of taste for, say, purity than other cultures that have a higher sense of taste for, say, repressed sexuality, or not really repressed, but secretive sexuality. So to say something that would be taboo would be to bring that out, and it's especially like you see how these types of things are all within religious frameworks as well. Like especially like Islam, there's a huge sense of distaste for the degradation of the Prophet Muhammad, for instance. Any time that occurs, that it's as if it hurts the individuals that see this occurring, and it creates a righteous vigor within them to stop such a thing. And these are parts of our essentially like biology in a way, because they're the types, they're the systems of feeling that we essentially have that are ingrained in us to keep our group alive, it seems. Hold on. And so, as I said, when you have a group that is able to have all of these types of positive and also the negative within it, then you're going to have, or at least in some capacity, that's the thing, depending on the situation, it's like if you have a current place in time where there are widespread diseases that are killing off people within your group, then you're going to have a necessity for a higher sense of distaste for anything sexual or anything that is disgusting in nature, because by holding yourself as being more pure, then that protects you from any external diseases or anything like that. And you can see this especially within, say, the Nazi regime, how they held themselves up as being that morally, or not morally pure, but the physically pure. Pure in that they are not filthy, as in, say, anyone external from their group. So it was very much and you can especially see how that would develop after, say, the Great War, where all of these new corners of the world are coming together and spreading diseases that are just killing off everyone around them. Then that would, it makes a lot of sense to both the individuals and within the group to create or it's not even to create, because it's like automatic, where these new tastes arise, or needs that they have arise, so that they can protect themselves from a plague basically spreading out throughout the land. And so that's when a specific taste rises in importance, the others in the same way kind of fall in importance. And so there's less of a need for liberty if you have a higher need for, say, sanctity or purity and healthiness, essentially. And there's less of a need for like care for others when there's some other like need going on within the group. And it's almost like there's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which kind of goes through the physical and all the different types of like needs within an individual to be happy, essentially, or to be fulfilled, with the peak of being self-actualization. And I'm not sure where these would exactly fit in line, but I guess it's also because like these are much more variable than, say, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because depending upon your upbringing, say if you're raised in a more religious society, then you're going to have a much higher sense of taste for the sanctity. And so if you see anything that degrades those things that you hold in high value, then that's going to, it's essentially an attack on your culture and your entire upbringing, and thus an attack on you. Because if your identity is tied to your culture, which basically it is for everyone, who you are depends entirely upon the upbringing that you've come up with. Seeing an attack on your religion, or even an attack on your belief system, which doesn't even have to be religious, it is like an attack on you. It has that same kind of emotional feel to it. Haidt brings up this real interesting anecdote, really, from when after he had like learned about evolution and Darwin, he went into England or wherever it is that Darwin's buried, and he saw people just walking over the grave of Darwin, and he had this like instinct within him, was like, no, stop doing it. This man's important. He's important to the system of science. Exactly. So it'd be like if somebody were to, within America, if somebody was to degrade the founding fathers, that's a kind of instinctual desire to keep that from happening within the more patriotic of the individuals within America. But those that don't have that same sense of taste don't see that as being wrong, essentially. Like burning a flag, if you look at it materially, a flag is just fabric, but there's meaning imparted upon it, especially by other individuals than yourself. And so what you're doing when you're burning, say, a flag, it is to attack in a way those other people, and usually it's done for a purpose, but and so rightly so, but it's very much divisive. And so if we can figure out a way to not step on the moral taste buds of the people that are with us within a group, then that would be quite good. So I've already kind of touched on this, but I think it's probably better to get a better understanding for this, because religion is a very tricky subject, especially in such a more secular age. Even within like religious communities, it's much more secular than it would be, say, in religious communities of old. Which, yeah, there's a lot of good that has arisen from that. But I think there's a bit of egotism to where we can throw away the useful systems of group togetherness or systems that keep groups together and along with each other so that they can thrive within that group and thus thrive for each individual within that group. So recently, Peterson was at Lafayette College, and he was asked about his definition of religion, and he said it's that which guides action. And it's a really interesting take on it, and it may be too simplistic for actual use. Well, it's simplistic, but it's not, as long as you keep the understanding that it's not merely that, well, I don't know, there's more to like the religious substructures that we have in place than just guiding action for behavior. That's seems like the core aspect to religion, though. So that's a good definition, I suppose. So by that definition, yes, you can include basically everything that we interact with within the world. Like if you were to read a cookbook or read a magazine with like pictures of food, that would guide action to causing you to become hungry and want to eat. So that's one aspect of like a very small scale religious text, perhaps. And that's something that would only occur within the short term, exactly. In the case of, say, other more commonly known religious texts, that's very much guides for action for longer periods of time. It seems like devoting a lifestyle off of certain religious texts. Like by that definition, like 12 Rules for Life is technically a religious text in that it guides the actions of people that are to read it, or really any self-help book. It is a religious text, very much so. And like science, this was brought up as being memes, essentially, are these kind of non-biologically based properties that can evolve through its interaction with actual biologically based individuals or species or things like that. And so to the point where kind of memes can kind of become more abundant and more important in certain cases than actual biologically based individuals. So like people dying for their faith or for their messages that they have, then that's very much a placing a meme in a higher importance than the host of said meme. And so we were trying to figure out exactly when do those what importance or when do those importances shift between the genetic necessity of individuals and the mimetic necessity of, say, these moral taste buds. And it's not just moral taste buds, but just the things that aid the group in whatever it is that is necessary. So like if there's a stash of food in a specific location, or say like there's a lot more wildebeests in one certain area, somebody could come back from that area, spread the meme to all of the hunters of his tribe, and then they could go hunt for all those wildebeests, bring it back to the tribe, and the scout that maybe didn't even hunt himself gets to succeed or gets to thrive from his spreading of that meme, of telling the information for where food lies. So if you can kind of extrapolate that out even more so to where like science is it's like scouters going out into the cosmos or into everyday matter to give us a better understanding of what it is that we reside within, so that in certain cases they can greatly benefit us, especially like medicine or technology, giving us a better understanding of for how the world works so that we can change it. But that's the thing with science and health. Well, yeah, science and health, these are very much things that tell us how the world is exactly. And in the case of, say, memes, these are things that are trying to tell us how we should act within the world. So, like, within the health community, they're constantly coming to that point of trying to increase the lifespan for people. And that raises the ethical question of how long should people live? That's like something that we don't exactly know. Do we want to create a society where people can live for 200 years? And what would that do to overpopulation or limitations on what people can have? So, like, if people live 200 years in their age, is there a limitation now for the availability for different like needs for the group, such as like food or space even? Like, is there... Anyway, these are like ethical questions that science can't necessarily tell you unless you first place a specific value within it, so that it can, like, say, in the case of Sam Harris, having the value of well-being, which is kind of too vague exactly, but if you were to maybe place the value of economic, so like capitalism is an economic system for how if you want to increase capital, then these are the actions that you can put into place. This is the system for how you can get exactly that. And so in a group that values capital quite greatly, then capitalism is a very useful tool to achieve that, or a very useful study. For a society that has a much higher importance within their moral taste buds of, say, care, then capitalism may be a study that is contrary to those desires. And so then there may be the attempt to create things that are more in line with that. Oh, hello. Oh, hey, Tyler.
Why can I hear nothing?
You can't hear me? Test.
I don't know if you can hear me, but I have no volume.
Yeah, I can hear you. Let's see. You not have your...
That was some good pantomiming, but I have no idea what it means other than adjusting volume levels, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, we should play. What's that one game? Pictionary. We're so good, dude. We're so good.
Okay. Great, but
all right. So you can hear me, obviously.
Yeah.
I just can't hear you. It's going through the speakers. Voice. I'm not. What the? And it's. I just checked the stream too, so the volume is coming through on the stream. I know that. Oh, I'm ruining it. I'm ruining it with technical difficulties. It's awful. All right, let's get rid of you. Let me try this.
All right. So yeah, that was Tyler. Now he threw me off for what I was talking about. No, he'll get me back online. Figuring out what it was. I think I had gotten kind of to the more conclusive end of it, and if I didn't, then that's all right. I feel like I was kind of like rambling on there, so I think what I was saying can be gotten. I wonder if let's see. So there's two different buttons here. There's leave call and then there's stop broadcast. And I don't want to stop the broadcast, but I wonder if I were to leave the call, then that might automatically stop the broadcast. Okay, good.
So,
good job.
Sir, how are you, John?
I'm doing good. Good to see you again. It's been too long. You've changed your look.
Have I? Oh, yeah. I guess it's been a while.
Mm-hmm.
The hair grows.
Yeah.
Unless I cut it, it just keeps growing, and even when I cut it, it just keeps growing, I suppose. But that's.
Mm-hmm. Do you have headphones, or okay. I guess I can mute myself whenever I'm not talking.
No. Let me fix that too.
All right. This is a good partner actually for this conversation. Though our own moral biases will definitely come into play here for our more religious upbringing and lifestyles. So we'll try to avoid that as best as we can, but it's gonna break through no matter what.
Oh, I can be as amoral as anyone, man.
Yeah, I suppose that's the more honest of the religious people are those that know exactly how amoral they can be and will be if they do not do certain things or if they don't.
Yeah, I value greatly the cultural programming that has been instilled upon me by my ancestors.
Exactly.
Yeah. The necessity and the relevance today for that conversation actually is I think it's paramount, actually. The most important thing we can be talking about. Is that what we're talking about right now? I have no idea. I'm just, oh gosh, man. Life's been crazy, let me tell you.
Yeah, that's kind of our
yeah, I just popped
in. Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah.
Fix this. I got some new equipment here, so I'm trying.
Ooh. Riveting material, though. We're working? You can still hear my echo.
Yeah, it's should have automatically switched. Apparently, it doesn't do that. Testing.
Did I hear myself or not? No, I can't. Okay, good. Is this working now? Okay, I can't hear my echo, so if you can hear me, then that's good.
That's strange because nothing's changed.
Well,
what is going on here?
I can't hear you. You muted your microphone.
That's in fact what I was saying. Now you should, perfect.
Okay, so I don't hear myself echoing, so that's good.
Lovely.
Okay, Great. So yeah, what we were talking about yesterday, and this is kind of the recap, I guess, of that. What was the group selection that occurs when kind of that's kind of what we kind of defined morality as, is the group selection so that the people within a set group can kind of thrive from those those morals put into place and acted out. And then that fits quite nicely with Peterson's recent definition of religion as that which guides action. So essentially, very much the kind of like oughts of the specific memes that aren't necessarily related to, or not necessarily related to the matter or the objective reality of a certain situation or of anything, but of how it influences the kind of acceptor of that, or the kind of receptacle for those memes in place to then guide action in a new type of way. So in that case, then fiction is very much, and like art, or at least good art, is religious in nature, because if it's good art, then it changes your worldview in a way that kind of essentially forces you to see things from a new perspective and then act in that same new perspective that you have.
Yeah. So can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can. You're good.
Yeah. So I think of everything in that way, actually, that that there's constant agreement between systems of cooperative energy, let's say, and the way that information systems organize themselves. So religion is like the meta-organization of all oughts. It's the repository of all oughts, or the greatest of oughts, or the greatest of good. That's kind of what it's become. Or our understanding of what we call religion is that behavior and that system of organization that relates to those things. And also, I think, our conception of the ineffable, right? So the fundamental nature of reality and God. This can be partitioned further down into anything and everything regarding behavior and action, right? So science is a type of religion, let's say, a sub-religion of oughts, right? It has its scientific method. It has the manner in which you posit a hypothesis and the way that you make inductive statements and draw conclusions about the world. And that if everyone follow these particular oughts, they receive, the blessings of God, right? It's which are conclusions about the world that we can act on further, right? And it's been extraordinarily successful. But the same thing can be said of almost any system, right? Look at like carpentry. You end up developing a system of even priesthood amongst carpenters. You can look at it in some way, right? You have masters and apprentices, and you have secret knowledge that's handed down. This happens with every single system of energy. It's really interesting. And that's how I see it. So religion is simply the repository of all the oughts that are to command us greater than the others, right? The oughts that supersede the ones that have been most successfully passed down from your ancestors, generation by generation, right?
Yeah, it very much is the kind of meta ethics, because like you can use basically like the scientific method to develop some sort of system of morality based upon a specific value that you first place into it. So if you have the value of capital, I brought up, you can have a specific system for how to act out that increases that capital. But science itself can't tell you why science itself is valuable. It just merely is, in the same way that capitalism cannot tell you why people are trying to gain a lot more capital. It's something that is already kind of in place. People already hold money valuable, and so anything that increases in that's what capitalism is. Whereas religion is kind of, it's much more fluid. I see it in nature, in that it there's no exact pin down, or there's no limited value that you originate with. There's kind of, especially I guess in the monotheistic religions, there's everything that is valuable is what we're aiming to kind of increase. And so that there's still these kind of things that will change in value. So is the value of capital more valuable in this time of crisis than, say, the value of truth? So are there certain lies that can be told that can increase capital in a dire situation? Say if you're like going through some sort of depression or something like that, which does not correspond exactly with the value that we hold of truth, but it does increase capital. So should we kind of go in that, which do we place a higher importance upon? Truth.
Well, okay, so this is, again, this going back to the way that I see all these as like systems of information and energy, each distinct within themselves, and yet in this strange infinite dance of interaction with all the other systems of energy that exist, and the ways that we can partition up the world. So capitalism is simply our discussion of the most efficient means of dealing with capital, right? And we say that there are these particular rules that govern it, and that if they're followed in this particular way, these are the results, right? That's what capitalism is. And yet this same behavior can be seen anywhere in anything at any point, right? And then within each and every system that you examine, they have their oughts, their morals, right? And so you can examine the system simply from within the system and look at the oughts to govern the most efficient manner of whatever it is you're attempting to produce, the good, whatever the good is. In capitalism, it's the production of more capital, right? In carpentry, it's good carpenter making a good product, a nice bookend or something, who knows, right? But it's this moral structure that produces the good within the system. Unfortunately, we live in the world where these systems collide and where they overlap in strange ways. And since everything's dynamic, they're always changing anyways, right? So when two systems collide, say the system of capitalism and the system of good health, good psychology, right, which is the main contention of Marxism, right, that it's bad for people.
Bad for individuals, surprisingly enough, because
right.
People have their own base desires that they want to fulfill, and
well, bad for certain types of individuals, and good for, right, which is an excellent analysis of the luck involved in certain types of talents, let's say, gifted to individuals by the nature of this crazy whirling reality, right? Yeah, so again, to go back to the main point, capitalism has its own set of morals within it to increase more capital. And so if you look at it simply from within that system, you can dictate very clearly what your goals are, and then you can develop those out. So an interesting case study, George Soros, fantastic at capitalism, okay, and points it out, right? Many people consider him an extraordinarily evil individual, though, because they're analyzing him from a different system of morals. They're now injecting his structure into a new system. Now, I agree that the guy has done some terrible, terrible things, and economically, it seems that he's produced outcomes in certain countries, and then seems to be orchestrating some very nefarious intentions in the background, right? That's a whole other conversation. Don't let me go there. Yeah. So in terms of morals, I see everything in that way, right? So religion, to go back to it, is then the development and the maintenance, the retention of the best meta ethics for people interacting with each other, and like how to behave and what to do, right? And we've seen a kind of moral evolution within the religions over time, that every one of them developed as a kind of reaction, as a reaction to the biology. Actually, it's like a biological reactionary. It's, you know, like even in Judaism, if you look at the circumcision, that's such a strange thing. It's like saying, well, that's just wrong, you know. And the female genital mutilation, I think that's done for slightly different reasons in certain cultures, but same thing, right? And body modifications of any kind, and in general, many of the oughts that we have are directly against some of our base, more primitive instincts, right? So like sexual impulse and things. It's one of the things that's controlled most prominently in a lot of religious institutions.
Yeah, and the act of fasting that completely contradicts your.
Exactly. That's a perfect example. Fasting. Yeah, it's like saying, no, I don't need that energy, right? You know, like that thing that sustains. It is such an interesting. It's such an interesting point, actually, that we're capable of doing that, right? I think it highlights distinctly the difference between this concept of biological imperatives and consciousness, and what it is to direct yourself as a conscious being and have choice over that. Yeah, I would say it's fantastic evidence in the court of a difference between the material matter and whatever mind is, whatever consciousness is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I brought up, I think, during our conversation, how there are certain systems of ethics that have short-term gains, but long-term failures. And
that's the dynamic nature of stuff.
Yeah.
Always changing. Yeah.
And so religion is, at least good religions, are ones that are sustainable throughout longer periods of time and able to adapt to along with the evolution, say, of the participants within that religion.
Yeah. Well, there seem to be these deeper truths, right? So we could say they're like the most prevalent or the most persistent truths within the religions, right? The 10 Commandments of Judaism would be like a strong example of these kind of base notions of thou shalt not commit murder, right? Like that's strong, right? Strong language. Honor thy father and thy mothers in there too, right? That is so lost, man. Like in our culture today, strangely enough, it's so lost that honoring of our elders is just gone. It's completely gone. Anyhow, where was I?
I brought up the longer aspect, or the longer term aspect of certain religions. Yeah. So like Zoroastrianism, which is dying out because they can't breed, or they can't bring in anyone external into their religion. Exactly. So it's like slowly dying off. And
your religion has to be able to adapt to its surroundings, right? And it has to have answers to the questions being posed. It's an extraordinarily important part of it. And if you don't have answers to those questions, you end up getting. It's a necessity that you start incorporating other systems of thought and belief to explain the questions that you have, right? So that's why I think that we've been seeing the evolution of the revolution of religious systems over time, simply to handle the questions that we have. And some of those questions have been basic and persistent over time, like the nature of reality and why do we exist and where are we going and what are we building towards, right? The notion of heaven and what it is to have perfect morality and perfect behavior. Perfect
structure to things actually occurring, whether or not they're random or teleologically based. Those are some, at least, larger questions that people have.
Yeah. Well, that we all have, if you've ever read anything discussing them, right? I mean, just even if you've never conceived of the questions on your own, or as you're tilling your field, you'd have some time to ponder, right? But not everyone gets a chance to sit down and be an armchair philosopher.
Yeah.
But if you've all encountered any material resulting in any of this thought or question, it's immediately apparent that there's just some very odd and strange things about life, and and how we develop our morality. And Peterson's famous for his discussion of Nietzsche and his development of morality and moral systems. So I think yeah, no, I'm right. I'm going to go down a crazy rabbit hole there. Stop.
All right. Something I was just about to say. I should have it in the notes somewhere. Okay, so there's this interesting thing brought up yesterday on how we hold certain people as being of higher moral importance. So why we hold them up as being worthy, essentially, of to be replicated or to be imitated. And it seems like one possibility, or at least what we were kind of working off of, was the desire for mating, essentially. So if you imitate this certain person, then it'll there's somebody that will bring wealth, essentially, to the group that it belongs within, and thus kind of rise to the hierarchy of the people within that specific group.
Right.
And there's certain cases where, depending upon the group that you have in place, there are going to be different ways to rise to that hierarchy. So in, say, certain cultures that don't have a high taste for truth telling, then being somebody that is able to tell the truth isn't going to get you very far in that group, and thus you won't be moral according to the group that you belong within. Whereas it may have some other, like, more valuable structure that they hold. Say if you belong to
it may also be a brighter beacon, though. It may also shine forth more prominently, right? The contrast of something like that is often more prominent, right? So
I think it really shows to the integrity of a group insofar as they are capable of some of these higher value systems that we have developed over time. But in specific instances, there are times where being a avid truth teller is not going to be the best thing for that group to flourish and succeed. So in a very, like, depressing time, to be somebody that has a kind of truth that they've learned of the very randomness of the universe, and that's, to them, their understanding of what truth is. They're going to be, if they were to spread that to a group that is in a already depressed manner, that's not going to win them many points. But somebody that has, say, like, The Secret, that or Follow Your Bliss, those types of figures, they're going to rise in the hierarchy, essentially. And
well, there seem to be multiple conceptions of what the Uberman is in a particular person. There's the individual that rises to the top of the hierarchy, the hierarchy of competence or dominance, whichever you prefer. But then there's also the kind of anti-Uberman. I'm thinking about this statement in the, let's say, the prophetic scripture of Christ that from Isaiah, that there be no beauty in him, that he should be desired. A very interesting phrase.
Well, even within Thus Spake Zarathustra, the Ubermensch is not just the top of the hierarchy, but the person that allows for those that follow after them to be built up higher than themselves. So right. It's like placing yourself as a brick within a bridge that can be built up off of.
Right, right. I think that's the Christ symbol as well. right?
Exactly.
The cross and the sacrificial raising of everyone else.
And we brought up how through a more, not necessarily materialistic, but more specific imitation of Christ, there are certain negative attributes that may come from that. Because if you were to kind of raise a group with the almost, because Christ himself didn't have children and died before he could have. If
Unless
you
you're
raise,
Dan Brown, no,
if you,
or Rose
what?
Crucian, or maybe he did. Maybe he did.
Oh yeah, if you're Dan Brown with the whole Da Vinci Code, yeah. Well, I think despite that, there are certain individuals that die without having kids, but we hold in high regard as being kind of moral foundatory individuals for our systems.
And you're saying that point of not having kids is important because it's not related to the hierarchy of mating and selection.
I think it's important because if you were to follow out exactly his lifestyle and your entire group did that exact same thing, then it would be just like Zoroastrianism, where it would die off eventually. But there's still the point to be made that Christ died not of himself exactly, but the external kind of forces at play that killed him. And so if you were to raise a group that did have that Christ-like mentality or that acting out of, then insofar as they are successful at reenacting Christ, then there may be no Romans exactly coming in and killing, or it wasn't even Romans, it was within that group of Jews kind of having the Romans kill him.
Right. It was a weird interplay of forces there, but
yeah.
Both groups are happy for it to happen.
So there's this kind of value play at system between genetic propagation or mimetic propagation, as in, say, Christ not being a genetic propagator, he was.
I would argue that it's the same. It's so. I mean, it's very strange and complicated thing to try to discover the progeny of any particular source. I mean, how things propagate is abnormal and crazy when you start to examine it, right? And so if you say that the individual is the genetic reproduction over time, then all of its utterings, all the vibrations of air, all the symbolic interpretation and composition is related to those, or it's related to the genetic manipulation. So it is hard to say that it's purely the physical structure of the genes, right? And our actual genetic differences are extraordinarily slim.
Yeah, and we kind of brought up the two kind of extremes between influential characters in history. One being the highest genetic propagator of Genghis Khan, and then the least genetic propagator of, say, Christ. Whereas if you look at how society is now, there's a lot less Genghis Khans in the world through if you regard Genghis Khan as a actor of specific behaviors. And there's a lot more of Christ in the world, at least in relation to, say, like Genghis Khan. And even, I mean, there's nobody that is fully, like, exactly reenacted Christ as well as we would hope. But there is the interesting aspect within mimetic propagation that it seems to spread faster, and if it's like a good meme that can like take kind of change the entire behavior of somebody that is a host of that meme.
Well, it spreads faster if the genetic components are there, right? Which is why culture predominates upon other genetic markers. So skin color, for instance, right? This is a huge hot topic on the internet right now. Hello, internet, have at it, right? Skin color, right? We have these extraordinary associations between genetic predisposition to certain cultural elements, which are these memes that are passed around, right? And there's nothing wrong with that, let's say, but it's plenty of evidence that that these memes resonate at a gene frequency, right? That certain kind of people antennas happen to resonate at, and it's a very excellent visual metaphor for me, and it seems to mimic reality. It's obvious, right? And so there is some truth in saying that because of the strong correlation, some genes will be better than others regarding something like some cultural aptitude or tendency, right? And that's extremely sad to say, but it's also not the same as saying that any particular individual cannot supersede whatever boundaries there may be or genetic frequency that they're vibrating at. Because it also seems to be that, let's say, some of these religious memes are capable of attuning any one individual to resonate at a frequency that works culturally with anyone, right? Or culturally with anyone of its similarly civilized and functioning effect or configuration, whatever variation there is in that. And there seems to be quite a bit of it, because we've been getting along fairly well in places like America for some time now, right? And certain cultures have gotten along fairly well for some time. The agitation that's existing right now, racially, for instance, it's being fomented purposefully for political and other, selfish reasons of people in power. But it's also fundamentally part of our biology. And I guess if we're talking about morals overall, this is an extraordinarily relevant subject and has a great deal to do with how people are perceiving each other. And I think it's something that we honestly, earnestly need to be discussing with each other to figure it out, to truly figure it out and take care of it, because it's no different than any of the other civilization ending attributes that we've seen in the past, right? If we pay attention to history, it is quite obvious that this type of behavior that we're seeing increase over time right now, this agitation, this hyperpolarity between groups and this hyper individuation, the identity politics is killing us quite literally, and we do have to do something about it. No, I don't want to turn this into that. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, within each, even within a large culture, there are the subcultures that each reside within it, that all have kind of their own systems of moralities or of group bindings that they have, so that group can kind of flourish and thrive. And so it seems like if we can find if we can utilize the meta ethics that encompass each of those subsections within it, then that would be.
Well, some of us are utilizing it, right? I mean, a lot of us are utilizing the best meta ethics that we have. The problem is one of agreement. We just all have to agree eventually upon the best type of behavior, right? We're having a crazy argument about it right now in our culture, and we're testing out all the various experimental designs and modeling, and then we're finding out that some of them suck, some of them just don't work, and we've got to drop them. And it's been going on for a long time. If radiocarbon and geological etc. dating is to be believed, billions of years, right? So I mean, we've been life has just been experimenting on the best possible way to behave, following all the current aughts, whatever those may be, at any given moment. We're at the most advanced front right now current time now, right? Piloting the most advanced hardware, right? Like this genetic creature and all its systems of energy that it relies upon, the sun and carbohydrates and proteins. And I think like the complexity of all of our systems, it's just astounding if you start thinking about it. Really just phenomenal. but it's been going on for a long time and we're still working on it. And we just, those who are paying attention to it and trying to do their best shall do it, right? I mean, that's what we're doing here, just having this conversation. In fact, trying to figure out what the best is, right?
Mm-hmm.
At least that's what I'm doing. And sitting in a chair.
Well, it's a discussion of morality, so it's what's the best ought.
Yeah.
What is the best ought? Yeah.
Well, so that's what's really interesting about it. I'm thinking a lot about determinism lately, and it seems like it's absolutely true, but only in reverse time, so only in the past, right? Determinism is true when t is negative. It's not true in the future. So it's not something that you can apply to that. That is, in fact, what makes the difference, right? If you look at it in that way, in physics, it would be like the change in entropy over time and things. But the same concept. It's that you can look into the past and see what is, but in the moment, the present, that's what makes the present the present. Consciousness experiences it as a choice of how to construct it. How to continuously construct whatever the hell it is that you're actually piloting, right? Well, that's what it seems to be, right? Like it's the question is always, what is the best way to do things? And the way that we're perceiving that is just by the nature of the constriction of our body shape and the way that we experience senses and a particular wavelength of light and all of our cultural, social nonsense that is the infinite complexity of all those combinations of things, and like that is the leading edge of morality, of what the best way of what the real is to become.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. So
I'm sorry. I think a lot about that because of quantum indeterminacy.
Yeah.
What it seems to be, it is bound up in that. It's.
Do you listen to Roger Penrose or?
Oh my gosh, dude! Have you read The Emperor's New Mind?
No,
I haven't read the next one in the series, but I really need to because I just discovered it. I think it's Hammer Off in Penrose's theory of consciousness and how it's bound up in certain configurations in some of the protein in our neurons and all. But
mm-hmm.
it's something like that. But I don't think. See, they're looking for something that's able to be influenced by quantum effects, let's say. I don't think that's necessary. I think that consciousness is simply like a field it's like a field. And just whatever the coordinated systems of information happen to be, that's the experience of consciousness. And if you combine, say, certain amounts of information in photonic wavelengths of this particular amount sent through this sense, the sense of vision, and certain wavelengths of pressure change in auditory and then proprioception and all that. If you combine all of that together, that's your conscious experience of, and then you have the option as a conscious entity to manipulate any one of those particular wavelengths, right? So you can manipulate the wavelength of light, and that's envisioning things. You may, in fact, have a genetic malformation and not be able to do that neurally. Maybe it's not genetic related. Maybe it's developmental or something, right? But there are people who have aphantasia who can't visualize. There are people who are deaf who can't hear, and then they have no conscious experience of that particular type. But that's what consciousness seems to be, is the ability to manipulate any one of those particular, and the sensation of those particular wavelengths all experienced at the same time. And not even at the same time.
Yeah,
there seems to be this weird
kind of overlap that's done after the fact.
Yeah. Well, there's like a gap too. There seems to be a gap of something like 100 to 500 milliseconds where anything occurring within that region, we can kind of loop into the same moment, right? That's why TVs can function at audio as being slightly desynced from the video, and you'll never catch it, right? It's related to that. It's this weird kind of blur of now, right?
Mhm.
And anything that you can squeeze into that is now. And that's just like quantum indeterminacy, you know. It's like this blur of what it could be. And at any given moment, if you measure it, it's going to be a thing, right? And that's what this leading edge of reality is, this leading experience of consciousness. You're seeing the experience of it becoming.
Yeah, that seems to be, at least within my own mind, at least a good enough refutation of determinism just via consciousness alone. Because if I can see my own actions and understand, like, especially based off of repeated actions, if I did something at one time and then it led to a bad outcome, that just because I realized I have this understanding of what kind of good and bad is, then that will change my actions, or it has the allowance to kind of change my actions to where I can choose, do I want to have that bad outcome again with like short-term rewards, or do I want to move on to it's similar in effect from a layman's perspective of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, where as soon as you kind of impose yourself into the situation, then that has it changes things in a way that can't be.
Yeah, it's the observer effect. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Anytime you look at anything, you're shining a light on it and therefore entering energy into the system, right? You're bombarding it with energy. And if you look harder, you're bombarded with more and more energy, right? That's the Heisenberg uncertainty. You get to a point where you can't bombard it anymore, interestingly enough. And that's related to the fuzziness of the bottom of reality, right? So it's an interesting correlation between those two things, or perhaps perception, just the way that we perceive it. But
yeah, I mean, it seems strange that there's kind of this assumption that determinism is proven true by science, when science requires a prediction and then the fulfillment of that prediction for it to be kind of valid within a scientific.
Yeah, well, I would say anybody in physics and anybody studying quantum mechanics is no longer capable of taking a hard deterministic stance unless they're just relying upon old ideas that they don't want to confront in their own minds, which is totally possible. You know, like people do that all the time, right? I do that. I'm capable of doing that, right? I used to believe that, and I don't want to, I used to believe that rhino horn was made out of keratin or whatever. Like, I don't want to go back and fix that fact. Pluto's a planet, damn it.
So are the other 300 different things out there.
Right.
Anyway, okay. So we kind of brought up yesterday the more utilitarian, or not utilitarian, but the utility behind having a lawmaker a kind of law throughout time and space, a god figure, just within the minds of the individuals that have it. Whereas when you have a system of morals that is very much determined only by the actors that are there in place to enforce those morals, then there are holes within what we ought to do. Because if you're put into a position where you can get a good outcome with no later bad outcome, that technically breaks a law that is in place, but you know that you cannot be punished for that because there's nobody around. It's like a victimless crime that no one will know what happens. That creates a flaw within the god of law of a secular society. It seems like there needs to be a rooting of morality within every single individual, and so especially I think via our conscience, essentially.
I think it's a representation of the fluid nature, the dynamic nature of moral systems. That's all it is. For some strange reason, we've gotten into the notion, and in Christian theology, it's tied up in the phrase "God is the same," is, was, whatever, right? Like it's the same yesterday, today, and forever, never changes, right? So it's tied up with that, but it's this notion that somehow perfection is this thing that was, right, and that it will always be the same, and that as it is right now, there's some weird structure that should be perfect, but we're not following it, right? But that never seems to be the case within our own lives, ever, when we're making a moral decision, ever. It's always, we hold up the system of moral beliefs, whatever it is, we see the contradiction, and then we compare it to some other system of ideas, right? So, if you have to steal to feed your family, it's the moral law system of legal jurisprudence in your whatever state you're in, or jurisdiction, and then your value system of taking care of your family. And if those two things collide, you do evaluate, right? Mm-hmm. Evaluate the system. It's nothing more than like manipulating the systems of energy within your neurons and trying to determine which one is more beneficial, right? Overall, which one do you value the most? Which one has the most internal emotional value, right? And that emotional value is tied up deeply to your system of culture and beliefs.
Yeah.
So it's, the criminal decisions that people make are very much tied up into their perspective, their view of the world, and the cultural system that dominates them.
Mm-hmm. I think the novel Crime and Punishment very accurately kind of portrays this, and I think it's very also interesting to see Raskolnikov as a Nietzschean representative, because he has that same kind of system of values, I guess, of the will to power and know good and evil, and he acts out that new system of values that he has, and the kind of position it places him in because of his own conscience kind of acting against him. And so I don't know,
but then we read it, we make a moral judgment about who he is and what was done and what is done with our current meta system of beliefs, right? And most of us would look down upon these kinds. It's the same way that people look down on the Nazis, as Jordan Peterson points out, right? And say, I would never be a Nazi. And his dictum to, well, say to yourself, I in fact might have been and probably would have been a Nazi, right? It's important to be able to see that aspect of it. Each individual is making a unique set of choices with a unique set of circumstances, and it's deeply tied up to the notion of forgiveness, right? The ability for any system of ethics and morals to forgive because of the extenuating circumstances of another system. That's what we do in courts. What's the judge or the jury does when they say, given all the evidence, looks like this, was okay, right? It's okay.
Mm-hmm. And it's beneficial for the group for when a individual that has fallen off the beaten path and has committed something that harms the rest of the group. If there's a way that we can transition them back towards the good for themselves and for everyone else, then that is a system that needs to be fully utilized to its maximum potential. And
I think the best way for that is, if we're talking about it's like decreasing recidivism rates or something, it's learning the value of work and providing, let's say, a teaching experience as to the benefits of avoiding the life that they chose or avoiding the particular mistake that they made, being a repository for the knowledge that they've gained. That's the value of making mistakes. and the forgiveness process. I think that's it. And that, in fact, is the only value found within it. Otherwise, it's better to never have made the mistake at all. But if you've made a bad mistake or a series of bad mistakes, the forgiveness process is such that you now become the transformation that occurs when the person is forgiven, be it immediately through some jury process that finds the defendant not guilty, or not being arrested, or at any point, or having served a sentence, and then the society saying, well, now you're free to go because you've paid for it. The value that must come from that is that somehow you become a deterrent to that, not just within your own life, but even greater value is to be found as decreasing that behavior within the wider culture. And we know that instinctually too, and I think we praise people extraordinarily well who do that, right? I don't know if you've ever seen any let's say a speaker or a famous speaker or individual who's come out of jail and spoken to youth groups or whatever, but people uphold those individuals with the highest esteem. Our culture seems to generally favor that a great deal, and I agree with it. It seems to provide an excellent benefit.
Well, there seems to be this internal sense of justice for what should be done, both for other individuals, but for your own individual self as well. And so, like in the case of Raskolnikov, he didn't have that chance to, well, he had the chance, but it's not like anybody caught him exactly. And so the only thing that was standing in his way from being a good person again was his own conscience. And through his own sense of justice, he deserved suffering for what he's done. And the only way out of it for at least his case, and I think it's applicable to many other cases as well, was Sonia, an innocent, perfect, even though innocent and perfect through his own perception. Somebody that relied upon him in a certain way. So I think there's kind of that understanding that you have a responsibility not only for your own fallible self, but a responsibility towards the ultimate good and innocent that is suffering because of you not changing and being capable of and it seems to only be through that type of figure. Okay, there may be other instances, but at least a very successful instance for forgiveness is through that innocent, pure figure that can give you
the martyr. You're talking about the martyr.
Yeah, that can give you the ability to want the better for yourself.
Right.
So psychologically speaking, this occurs within Christianity, where like somebody that is a sinner by their own conscience, they're a sinner that deserves suffering. The invitation in of a kind of external figure within that to embody themselves, that creates the need and desire to want the best now for the being that dwells within you.
Yeah, well, right. So the best that dwells within you is according to whatever conception, either internal or external.
Mm-hmm.
And the maturation process seems to be that weird kind of amphibious flip that occurs between the externalizing process of the culture inculcated within you as the parents dictate to the children what the good is, and then whatever mysterious process transforms it into the internal structure within, at some point blossoms into the adulthood of choosing for yourself as the Uberman, essentially, what the good is. Right? Nietzsche's understanding of Uberman is further beyond that, and saying that the structure as the whole on top of that can be further disintegrated and such. But I think it's that process in general, which can be described as finally dictating for yourself what the good is and seeing it come to fruition, right? Like seeing it actually happen because of your choices.
Well, there's kind of this internal structure that has intimations for what good things are. And so like you can kind of ask yourself certain moral questions as to whether something is good or not. And you can't exactly describe why. You can give like rationalizations afterwards for, oh, the reason is because so and so and so. But it's like you've come to a conclusion for what is fitting to your own moral tastes, and then coming up with the reasons for why that is. Johnathan Haidt's done different experiments along with this. But I think like we were doing a bit of this within the discussion. Like, had Jesus had certain physical responsibilities for, say, children, then his actions would not be morally good. What he did, sacrificing himself, would not be that would be morally reprehensible because he has certain individual.
Yeah. See, here's some weird arguments you start making though. Like, let's say that again, behavior tied so distinctly to genes somehow, right? Broadly, culturally speaking, we see these tendencies, and we see IQ distribution according to genetic predisposition and such. All sorts of things that indicate that behavior and you know, like father, like son, like daughter, like mother. You know, like we all understand these things intuitively, and it all makes sense that these things are passed on this way. But I'm sorry, what was I saying?
Well, okay, so imagine exactly the same as Jesus's life, but instead...
okay, sorry. Oh, yeah. Okay. Right. Jesus could have and should have passed on his genes, right? Mm-hmm. He should have gone out and like fathered as many children as possible, right? Like that's one argument that could be made. And since he didn't do that,
no, that's not necessarily the case I'm making. If
no, I'm not saying you are. I'm saying that's one argument that could be made. Right?
Yeah.
The question is, how do we define these moral systems, and how do people make this decision?
Especially in the age we are now, mimetic propagation of good genes or good memes that can kind of indwell within the behavior of individuals, not necessarily genetically tied at all, is a more moral good than purely genetic propagation.
I would agree. Actually.
At a certain point in time, when, say, you have small communities, then genetic propagation of the good is much higher in importance. But especially now, with so many individuals within on the planet, there is a much wider availability for...
That's a good point. That ratio of genetic importance to mimetic importance, that's interesting. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so, but there's still the moral responsibilities that are associated when you do have a genetic inheritor to yourself. So we already kind of like hold like fathers that abandon their children as being morally reprehensible in certain fashions because of their own removal of, or not removal, but removal of themselves from taking on responsibility. And so if Jesus had his own children prior to spreading out his mimetic genes, and he abdicated his responsibility for his genetic inheritors, we would see that, I think, as morally reprehensible in a certain way. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Can you get me some more water?
More Wawa.
Thank you. Sorry. It's my sister.
Well, okay, so if it goes according to patrilineal heritage, Jesus doesn't need to spread himself using his genes anyways, right? It's all virgin past. And I think that's a really interesting point, that the Father, the Heavenly Father, fathers the child through a virginal process.
Thank you.
Right? The development of that individual is tied up to something akin to a non-genetic heritage, right? So that's a very interesting relationship there. And
Yes.
and Christ himself, in fact, said a few interesting things about that. He said that he does only what he sees the Father do, right? That I have only done what I've seen the Father do, and that he, I think, in an intercessory prayer in John 17, it talks about the wanting the people to be one with him as he's one with the Father. And there's really interesting conceptualization of what it is to be the perfect and the good that is unrelated to genes, right?
Mm-hmm. And there's this action that occurs not even of your own conscious putting in of it. It's kind of like in the Tao Te Ching, it talks a lot about there are the masters that do without doing, leaving nothing undone. And it's like just by being, they act out or they represent a specific thing of.
Yeah, well, it's a conceptualization of perfect, because what consciousness seems to be is the piloting of attention. It's the piloting of whatever the current stuff is, trying to reach perfection, the best course, the most efficient manner to achieve its goals and its desires, whatever complicated sub-collection, goals those are, hunger and sexual desire and comfort and all that, right? It's so that the most beneficial harmony of all those things is the best individual. And if all those things are in unison, what piloting is there to be done, right? The perfect structure of a crystal lattice is, no change, no dynamic structure. And that's that weird conception of heaven again, right? That perfection exists in the final form, in the teleological infinities of perfect and unchanging form. It's really,
I see it a lot like as fractals, that there's an inherent pattern to this goodness that will be constantly repeated throughout time, even with separate particulars. Like the particulars are almost unnecessary.
Well, I see it as the equation that produces the fractals. So I think of everything in terms of rule and law. It's just a weird German phrase that came to me. Anyhow,
so that's
everything is law. Like everything is, and the way that we have been most successful in science is our attempt at understanding things in that way, that all things are governing according to some rules and structure that we are attempting to devise or understand through our experimentation and modeling. And so it can be conceptualized in that way, that then in fact there is no substance to matter. Like we drill down as far as we can. There isn't anything really touching. There's nothing contacting. There's no transmitting of stuff that we thought about as like kinetic energy, and it's all very odd down there, right? And so I now think of things not in terms of like atoms and like little balls that bounce around, but it's like systems of intention and choice, because that seems to be what consciousness in the field of consciousness is the element of choice, or the recognition of different options or potentialities and the choosing of one of them, right? And the falling behind of the other. And that ties back into the forgiveness and in fact the notion of people having to feel the pain after they have committed some act of immoral nature or something. like that pain is one part of you dying off. That's a necessary part of it, right? And the becoming of the new is the pain of that thing dying off. And there's one way to do it. You can either live through the pain and the grief and the suffering, and then naturally the old cellular structure and the old neural tissues will die off. That's literally what happens, right? I mean, it just dies of its own accord because, well, I mean, you can revisit it as often as you like and try and keep it refreshed, right? But over time, people's emotional, lability and stuff changes just because of the nature of the degeneration of the neural tissues and the energy systems that are related to it. So there's that, and then there's this other type of forgiveness, which is like immediate. It's like a restructuring of perspective. It's where the new current self looks at the old self and says, this is useful in some way. And that's the individual that goes and then teaches others not to be what they were, but to be what they are, right? The stronger soul.
Yeah, it's that common element of the is-ought distinction because of rule and law. There's like, it's not like things fall down because they're supposed to. That's what they do.
It's the combined coordinated effort of all of those systems of intention and energy that we call molecules or whatever element that we're looking at, or subatomic particles or macromolecules or the whole structure of the end, all of them obeying the same rule, go that way. Why? Who the hell knows? Call it gravity, right? Well, why do protons and electrons behave the way they do? We just have these rules that say, oh, that's just what they do. But that's our fundamental understanding, is that's just what they do. It's all very interesting to think about it, but there's no way. See, our modern conception of morality seems to be that we're just escaping this idea that we have control over this process of is and ought, and that we make the is by choosing the ought. And we've fought that now with modernity by saying, well, we just kind of choose whatever, and that will work. We choose according to our own particular desires. And then what we've discovered is now, well, that's fine and dandy. Maybe that's entirely true, but it's true within your own system. There's a meta system. There's always a meta system. You derive sustenance and resource from other systems of energy, and be it looked at the caloric level or at the system of cultural beliefs that you pass back and forth, and the utterances that you have with your passerbys and your acquaintances. Like, all of that's related to your system of belief. And so like that was I think Jordan points out that the Piaget notion that you have to be consistent in yourself, your family, your culture, your wider culture, now and throughout eternity, essentially, that's the best organizational structure. And it makes total sense. I mean, you can't imagine physically how any of these chaotic self-independent systems are going to come into contact and just naturally harmoniously come together. We don't see that in nature, right? I mean, if you're not happily going about the revolutions and rotations in the solar system, you're some weird random comet that's about to collide with something. And if you're Shoemaker-Levy and you hit Jupiter, well, woe is you, right? Like, there are these, you have to be a part of the system in order to be safe, let's say. Mm-hmm. And that's an interesting point. I haven't actually read Maps of Meaning yet. I want to. Yeah. But the beginning of it, I have read, and he says that. He says that he was protected by Christianity, so to speak, right? It's like, it's an interesting observation and totally true.
Well, I know he's like in the process of recording the entire thing in the same way he did for 12 Rules for Life.
I can't do audiobooks. Oh, man.
I'm kind of the same way, because
it's the wrong pace.
It's almost like imparted thought within me instead of my own. It's not necessarily a dialogue, but it almost feels like.
No, it's a difference between, this is a key point that educators noticed, and I think they haven't really understood why. But yeah, visual learners, for instance, everywhere your eye looks, you're choosing where it goes, right? You get to choose. That's an interesting point about like what eyes are doing and the windows of the soul and all. But everything you look at, you're choosing to look at. And so the visual process is very self-determined, whereas the auditory is a pace set by another. And you wait and you wait. And that's why ADHD kids can't do it, right? And that's why Lots of people just can't handle that particular pace. They have to have their own, right? And still others learn at a tactile pace, which is a still slower kind of wavelength, right? Where energy comes in and information comes in chunks that are at completely different wavelengths. So there's it's an interesting observation, and it's also tied into morality. I keep trying to bring it back. I don't know if I'm going off on crazy tangents all the time, but to tie that into morality, the way that we determine our morality, and this is a Nietzschean point too, is fundamentally tied to these biological imperatives and these kind of substructures, right? And so your genetic predisposition to, say, wanting to learn in this way is probably tied up to some, maybe the occipital lobe and its various components and the orientation of them receives energy in a more dopamine inducing fashion, right? And that is why you like to learn visually, perhaps. And it's also tied into, the frustrations you experience with whether or not it matches your pace at learning and all that, right? And all those are complicated sets of functions come together as your experience of the personality of, well, I don't like to learn that way, right? That's your current feeling of it. And then you express it with those words. And that's your morality now, right? That's not for me. Not for me. It's a big problem with our education system, in fact, because we sit everyone in these little chairs, everyone exactly the same, and say, hey, you're all the same. You're all going to learn the same way. And that be damned. Sorry. Yeah, it didn't work out for me. I didn't pass through the education system very well that way. But it's the way that we structure morality is deeply tied into the way that we perceive biologically. And we've got to pay attention to that more. We have to. Jordan's attempt to provide tests to people, I think, is extremely necessary. It's a very good idea for everyone to get a good concept of themselves and what predispositions they have and how they're actually seeing the world. Because what's interesting about consciousness is the moment that you're aware of it, you can manipulate it, right? Like we use this in biofeedback stuff all the time. Like once you can pay attention to some weird part of your body that you never knew existed before, you can control it. Like I can control my hiccups. Interesting tidbit. Because I became aware of them one day, right? Strangely enough, that's an interesting story, but I just became aware of the diaphragm. Now I have conscious control over it. I can just tell them to go away. I don't ever hiccup more than once or twice now. But it can go on as long as I want it to. It's very strange, right? But like we have that ability. Once conscious, whatever consciousness is, it's awareness of the ability to interact with something and choose it. So our broadening of these moral structures and our understanding of them is an extraordinarily good process in the evaluation of how we behave, right? Like we have to be able to talk to each other about how we're choosing the good and all come to an agreement on, oh, that's working for me and it's not working for me. And well, why isn't it working for you? Is it because it's internally inconsistent, or is it because you're placed into a larger system in which it is inconsistent? That happens all the time, right? If you want to be a good man in Auschwitz, good luck, right? If you want to be a good man in Nazi Germany, good luck. That's the point of Peterson and others, that and Solzhenitsyn probably, right? That everyone has that capacity, surrounded by the evil.
I think that being a good man in Auschwitz ties, surprisingly enough, into the how to educate people. In order to educate people in a way that they're learning and comprehending and keeping with them, you have to relate it back to some sort of value system that they already hold within them. So, like, people won't learn to read until they find out, oh, there's cool things within these books that I want to know more of that I would need to read myself.
I'm teaching my boys to read right now. It's
cool.
It's fascinating.
Just finding those books that they can easily get into and like learn the kind of like magic behind that. Yeah. But in the case of like being a good man in Auschwitz, in the same way, you have to understand what it is that is the value system that is within the people that you're interacting with, even when those value systems contradict your own. At least coming to or attempting to come to some sort of understanding between each other, because like the morality behind the Auschwitz camps makes sense for a culture that has purity and healthiness as their highest value, their God, to utilize that moral need within the collective unconscious of the individuals within that group.
Conscience, conscious, conscientious, all those words just gibberish.
Yeah. To utilize that need for, or it's really utilizing their sense of disgust, and it's an evolutionarily developed need within that time frame because of the consequences to the Great War and all the many plagues and diseases that accompanied these new individuals all interacting with each other and spreading these new germs with everyone.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've conceptualized it that way for a long time, I think. The people have perceived aliens and alien culture as potentially foreign and hostile to their way of life in a very pathogen-like way, right? And it totally makes sense, because at that microscopic level of interaction, it's kind of perhaps perceived in the same way. You can think of it in terms of the neural structure being, disliking the new pattern of imprinting, right? It just doesn't function, doesn't like it. And so, yeah, what I've really been thinking about lately is about how to get all of us to agree upon a good moral structure. It seems like so many of us could potentially do that, and then many of us aren't really concerned with that notion at all. That there are these two modes of living, right? That there's an attempt at agreement, and then there's an attempt at like self-preservation, right? This protective, defensive mode that people have, and it seems extraordinarily heightened. I think it's highly bound up within the kind of cultural cycles that we go through politically, and what we are perceiving now as a battle of CNN and Fox, right? Of Glenn Beck and Don Lemon, right? But in the past would have been Genghis Khan and any of the numerous millions that he slaughtered, right? Like that's our sense of it, right? And our cultural sense of whether or not we need to behave as people who should agree, or whether or not we need to behave as people who should be defensive, as we're surrounded by these hostile foreign ideas or invaders, is bound up greatly within this weird process of this cycle of going back and forth between what in American culture right now is this left-right kind of swing, right? This political swing of government power versus individual power is really the way to look at it, I think, which again is tied up with the maturity thing. It's the question of whether or not you want people to dictate your morality outside with a gun versus internalized, right? Do you want to be responsible for yourself in the production of your own moral system and values, or do you want to offload that desire to others? And there's a big and long battle over whether one of those is better than the other. And I think whichever you prefer is the one that you say is better, right? It's weird that it's a combination of the two that should be the balance, right? It's like you don't have light without the electromagnetic spectrums balancing each other out in this weird sinusoidal dance, right? Like you don't have culture without this weird dance of left and right, back and forth, pulling on each other, back and forth through the ages. Progress. No, don't progress. Change. No, don't change. Everything's fine. No, everything's not fine. It's the best of times. It was the worst of times, to get Dickensian on it. Right? It's like, that's us. where the hell are we now, man? Like, we're in chaos land, right? That's what it seems like. We're at the edge of another flip, or maybe, yeah, I don't know. I think that's what it is. The edge of another flip, right? It's like that's where things are in flux. That's where the boundaries and the Mandelbrot set are so weird.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's really interesting how, as Peterson brings up, within Christianity, especially the New Testament, there's this high importance placed upon the logos, which has like the meaning of dialogue between two opposing forces, which is very much related, I guess, to the Tao. And so
the Tao is the way, you mean, like
the
path of, okay.
like the yin yang symbol, how these two are, you can't have.
I love that symbol,
one without the other.
I love that. I mean, I wish that was, so I'm Christian, right? But I wish that were the Christian symbol. I do.
Mm-hmm.
I totally do. It's freaking cross. Come on, man.
Really? Well, it's just it's especially interesting when you think about the inner dots that, like, there's the black dot that is in the heavens, and then the white dot that's in the hell below.
That's exactly what I'm thinking. And it's their desire to return to the other side that's causing the two to swirl around. That's how I see it. It's exactly how I see it.
Well, I also see it as these two smaller dots are kind of the same dot. It depends upon the context that the dot is placed within. So in like Psalms, it's always talking about how you are kind of the light, us in the presence of the greatest good makes us appear as dark as coal. But when we kind of take that light and use it, then we can be the light in kind of the darkest areas.
Right.
Such as like in Auschwitz or something like that.
Yeah. And as you convert yourself and your energy and all the systems of energy around you into the brighter light, as you shine upon the hill, your beacon of light, that's the same as like trying to get back towards that other side of whiteness, right? Or darkness, however it is that you see it, right, from that particular time. That's the strangeness of it, right? And as you're attempting that, what you're doing is you're bringing your surroundings with you back over to the other side. But there's so much bound up in that symbol. It's like so freakishly perfect. It even, I think, and attempting to visualize subatomic interactions and things, like the way that I've been trying to understand it lately, it's so strangely right on. It's weird, but the yin yang symbols. I think it's a beautiful conception of the way that we should see ourselves, right? And the way that we should produce our moral value judgments in general. That was another dictum of Christ, right? That you shouldn't go around judging a bunch of people all the time. I think it's extraordinarily important that we pay attention to that, because that seems to be an extremely necessary component of this wild hostility that occurs at these boundary edges. Again, I don't think we can escape or should. But yeah, I could talk forever on that weird symbol.
Yeah.
Don't let me. Oh, it's so cool.
So what, over the course of the discussion that we had yesterday, it kind of came to, at least for myself, a better understanding of.
Oh, that's right. This is a synopsis stream. Oh man, I'm ruining it. Oh,
no. It was good, because these are all. It's much more natural this way, because like I have several of the points that we've gotten in, interjecting them, and we're coming to them together again.
Okay, cool.
What was it? Oh yeah.
That's just so, that's the weird genetic mimetic agreement aligning up, right? That's the synchronicity of whatever.
You need the particulars in order to portray the abstract. That's kind of one main point, I guess, from Kierkegaard's book on Abraham and Isaac.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, you develop the abstract via the particulars. I totally agree with that. Yeah, that's Descartesian analysis too, I think, right?
Well, it's kind of like the interplay between Plato and Aristotle, where Aristotle says in order to know what a thing is, you look at all the things that build it up. And for Plato, it's like what we are the small parts that build up some greater thing.
Yeah, well, I think it's the both. I think it's both. Yeah, that's the weirdness of it. And that's the yin and yang of it. It's both. It's both of those things at the same time. It's the acknowledgement that biology is the is, and yet isn't without the ought, right? It's like it's so weird, right? Like those two things have to exist at the same time. It's philosophically and kind of metaphorically, I think of it as in the universe, there's really only there's like two actions you can add or take away from. That's it. And at the fundamental level, it's something like adding energy and taking away energy from a particular area or thing, right? But at our level, it's yes or no. Everything can always be drilled down to like a kind of binary supposition or binary proposition or something of that nature. It's always a singular choice versus the non-binary or the zero of not choosing that, which ends up, strangely enough, being a sea of infinite other potentialities, right? Or at least we think of it that way. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. I mean, that brings up exactly a lot of the problems that arise when trying to develop a moral system. Because if you attempt to create something with absoluteness behind it, then it may occur where the society itself develops because of that absoluteness into a way that certain aspects of that are no longer required. I'm thinking especially in the case of like so many laws within the Old Testament about slavery. And it's interesting because how I think through Jewish culture they've been able to still take those laws as useful for us was to
the 613.
Well, it's
how many do you follow? It's like it's so weird, man. That's evolution. It's like we pick and choose, like whatever the best, what makes sense.
Yeah, well, I believe the Jewish culture themselves, they through the recognition of history, they were able to see how their laws on slavery were much more liberal in nature than, say, other people's laws at that place in time, and especially when taking in the understanding of every man and woman is a image bearer of the infinite, then that's how they've been able. Yeah. And there is that's what allowed them to evolve their moral system by taking in the spirit of the law as opposed to the letter of the law.
Right.
Because the letter of the law is exactly those specifics that are in place. It just is like we individuals, we exist for a finite amount of time and then we cease to exist, or whatever happens to us. If we were to take the specifics behind Christ, then we would be restricted to that place in time when everything else around us has changed because of his imposition in time. Just in the same case as the Ubermensch example, he was that cornerstone, that chief cornerstone placed for the building up of whatever's coming. So like you can imagine it as like a pyramid shape or as a bridge, as Nietzsche uses.
I think of it as just the most fundamental, the foundational, right, upon this rock, right? The foundational, the things that will not and should not ever change. And it can be distilled down to the two things that he claimed laws, right? to love God, which is the conception, the greatest conception of good, and to love your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah.
Or to acknowledge that your equal, right, exists in the same fashion that you do, and should be treated in the same way that you want to be. Like those I can't get around those two concepts as being a necessity, as a fundamental quality of a good functioning system of energy, be it whatever, anything, right? There has to be a mutual exchange of good of some kind, right? There has to be a balance, a homeostasis, a quid pro quo. It has to be occurring of some kind. And it has to be according to some conception that is not bound within that singular self view, right? And that's exactly what you're talking about, the perspective of the time, right? If anyone ever tells me that they have the best and sole good idea, I say, that's great. I totally believe you, according to your perception.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's such a useful perspective to have, especially when reading books from a wide variety, especially like contradicting varieties, of having that understanding of these are fundamental truths that they hold, and that's why they're bothering writing these down, of course. Like even looking at the Bible in that exact way, these are what they knew to be true, and you can learn from that.
Yeah.
All right.
That system of record keeping is very important. It's very, very important. It's what's so fascinating about right now, the YouTube culture and such. It's phenomenal, the ability to keep records of our ideas and thoughts and things as they're occurring in real time, and to present the information in a way that's it's far more, let's say, captivating for many people than the pace that is set by reading, right? Like there's just a difference in pace that many people appreciate. Yeah. I think it's really interesting. This is taking place. I wish I could get involved more, and I probably will be. But
yeah, well, that's the thing. We're brought into this world with a certain set of responsibilities that we have to recognize and to understand the weight that they hold within our minds, to know exactly which should be overemphasized and which should be underemphasized.
Well, in absence of those responsibilities, let's say the internal imperatives take over, which are the biological ones, right?
Yeah. Well, that's exactly what we kind of we came to over the conversation, was this understanding of the rank system through genetic or through moral good. So coming to the understanding that moral good or morality is a kind of group system for binding together so that all within that group can flourish than if they were to be separate from that group. So, something to that effect.
Yeah. I see it as a good, better, best, and then evil. That's how I classify morality, actually. Good, better, best, and evil. So almost everyone is good, just by the fundamental nature of biology. You represent the successful reproduction of some billion-year-odd chain of life and evolution, right? So the successful fundamental execution of your biology is enough to call you good, let's say. Your attempts at the destruction of those things, the destruction of the systems of energy around you and their ancestral lines, let's say, is evil. And we classify it that way. In fact, in most religions, the reproductive rights and the abilities and such are governed underneath the same kinds of severity and law and the way that they're seen, because it's the creation and the development and control of this lineage of systems of energy, right? So that's how we classify evil, I think, is tied up in those things. And then there's better, right? So there's good, better, and the better is like the middle class, right? You can think of it that way. Better is like what the vast majority of people will be doing all the time, scanning the world, trying to find their best route conceptualized within their own framework, so let's say. And so doing the best for themselves and their family. That's an artificial restriction, but just conceptually to think of it that way. And then the best, the very best, is the individual who can do the greatest good for themselves, the family, everyone, all the time, and just reproduce this effect. And everyone just like, oh, it's just so perfect. And we don't know why it's so perfect, but it just is right. You hear it, and it's like this effect that Peterson has on people, right? He's saying the words in a particular way and fashion that is exciting these kind of fundamental symbological concepts and deep mythological concepts and structures, and igniting them, right, in the interest and getting the dopamine going, and all these people are like, yeah, woo, right? Like that's how I see it. Good, better, best. And we've got to stop saying that the good is evil for most people, right? This is what's going on a lot in our politics right now. We're saying the good or the better is evil, which is crazy, right? It's like so accusatory. It's tied up in our conception of Satan, I think, in Christian concepts. The accuser, right? The one who goes around constantly saying this is wrong and bad and must be destroyed all the time. It's this Antifa nonsense, right? It's too much hate and vile control, right? An attempt to decide the fate of others.
Well, you also have to take into consideration that I don't think anyone has the intention of doing evil when they commit certain actions that they have. There's always some sort of reasoning that they have within their own head for why this is like a necessary action that must be taken place by you. So
right. That's why everyone is good at base, I say, and why our judgment should be that, and why our penal system sucks so much. Like, it's the shittiest thing I've ever seen, really. You want to talk about how to make bad people? This is what we do with our penal system is how to make bad people. It's designed to humiliate and discard the remnants of humanity. It's just awful, man. I don't know if you've ever had to experience it yourself, but
no. But yeah.
I confess live. Do you confess? Man, we've been so crazy throughout our history, really. If you think about what people have done in our moral structure, it's been really weird. No one expects the Spanish Inquisition.
Yeah. So, just exactly what you were talking about. We're trying to define down exactly what that system is of morality, because we have the intuitive nature to procreate. That is the replication of our own genes. But besides that, there's certain times where there's certain instances where our surroundings require us to act outside of that base desire for a more altruistic, in a sense. Let's say
I'm sorry. No.
Don't interrupt. Say in the case of, just since we're already talking about it, Sonia in Crime and Punishment, when your biological parents have deemed themselves unfit for the development of, say, your siblings. These are not your own progenitors, but they are like one step up higher than you for your biological responsibility. So in certain cases where, like, say, your parents have died, you disregard for the moment your biological needs in order to place a higher importance upon the needs of those that share your genes in a way. And if you work your way up higher from there, say your children are raised up well, and your siblings are raised up well, and your community also is raised up well, you can work your way out to the exactly like what Christ, his example is of the fundamental spreading out of into the world of
blossoming of a single sacrifice in life into a life-changing, world-changing conception, right?
And it's interesting because if you look at things from a genetic perspective, we're all crafted down from the same originating factor. So we're all essentially that same one gene over many different instances, and like changes over time. So like you can.
I agree with you on that. Let me refine just a tad though. I think it's two genes, two sets of genes, male female split.
Yeah. Well,
I think it's fundamentally related to the fundamental nature of reality, the adding plus subtracting duality of things. Yeah.
Well, it seems to be that there would be some sort of splitting of a single gene. So, like in religious context, it's the
rib.
Yeah. Well, and it's not even just like a specific rib. It's just a two sides of kind of
the presence. Yeah, the presence of the genetic differences in distribution within the Y and X chromosomes is. I mean, we've got a fairly good understanding, I think, of what biologically is different, and we're getting a better understanding every day. Yeah, but I mean that. See, I'm trying to understand the origin of life, and how it's created and how it started, and I'm not seeing a way that it can be developed randomly from just the random permutations of molecules for some pretty simple, some pretty straightforward reasons. One of them related to the kind of the necessary complexity that you have to maintain genes and keep them free of mutation. To propagate a successful sequence of genes, you need a fairly large amount of them just from the start, because you have to encode things that do error correction too. So it's a very strange non-bootstrappable problem, it seems, at the very bottom of things. I'm not sure how abiogenesis could take place, but I think so. So in my conception right now, it seems very much so that there are different strategies for the development of these encoded molecules, let's say, right? And that each of them are variously successful within their systems of energy, right? And that over time, the changes that have occurred in evolution are the representation of the successful choices of the individual units of genes as they progress through time. So I think male females, it's like it's designed into life, right? It's weird. Not much of a difference, but an important one.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like Brett Weinstein brought up in his, I believe, latest discussion with Joe Rogan, how despite having like very different origins, the plant world, such as like with flowers, they're very much showing similar attributes to a male and a female. Not necessarily personality, but like behavior and aspects to themselves. But there's still, I mean, I have like very little understanding of fungi and how apparently how there's like 50 different genders within how they correlate. It's just something much more complex than I'm able to understand, I guess.
Fungi are very, very strange.
Yeah.
For a number of reasons.
Exactly. Anyway, so I'm going to, let's see, share screen, because I ended up looking up, let's see, share, the group selection just with after our discussion last night, and it is on the Wikipedia page, and it seems to have that same kind of correlation.
Your tab selection is not improved, John. Good grief.
Yeah. I know. And that's actually one of
I'm not going to count
those I have.
Hey, you better have a lot of RAM, mister. I hope you got a lot of
I'm
RAM.
running off a laptop, so everything's pretty slow. So
Oh man, you're sabotaging. All right, we got some
the,
push
the
dolls.
exactly, yeah. So this is on the Wikipedia page for the group selection, and I guess group selection is kind of a more controversial element of uh, evolutionary biology. But it seems to make sense even from a selfish individual gene's perspective.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because it's going to be producing the types of genes that thrive in altruistic. Oh, it's like levels of altruism for specific genes.
Right.
Like,
right. The individual, the family,
mm-hmm.
and the culture. Right. So that the gene, the cell, the organism, the group. Like, yeah, exactly. It's those nested systems of cooperative energy where each are mutually beneficially uh, interacting at some boundary layer, right? It's this weird thing that just crops up again and again at various levels throughout existence.
Yeah.
At the cellular level, at the subatomic level, at the cultural level. It's really interesting.
And what's interesting is, like, if you have a problem with one of those levels, it's going to be kind of working outwards in two different directions for all of the smaller groups within that larger group, and also the large group as a whole, because there is an aspect of itself that is currently flawed or in a less ideal situation.
Yeah. Well, let's say, so I would say that there is an asymmetrical distribution of failure, that it tends to propagate outwards rather than inwards. So you would, this overlays with visual metaphors of, say, like subatomic interaction and the way that valence electrons interact and the way that energy systems are bound to protons and such. But it's essentially, you have your core system, which is the strongest unit, the strongest system of ideas and beliefs. And as long as that doesn't change, the thing is what it is, right? It exists as it is. And so that a hydrogen atom is the proton, and that's it, right? You start changing that, you start adding protons, who knows what you get, right? You get this crazy table of elements. And culture is the same way. You have these core structure, principle, and ideas, and you build up systems of stable energy on top of that. These are electron orbital shells and things, visually, metaphorically. Same thing, though. But as you decrease the stability of a particular shell, the shells rely upon that shell for its foundation can no longer function, right? Because their communication with the overall structure of the system relies upon that link as its kind of harmonious whole, right? So they're all kind of orbiting each other in a particular way, and the same is true for our cultural interactions. We're all orbiting each other in a particular way. And so I think that there is an asymmetric distribution of error rate. So anyone that's relying upon a particular system of beliefs is going to experience far more collapse and change and chaos than anyone going the other direction, right? Which is relying upon
it becomes unstable. It becomes unstable without that.
Yeah, unstable and can become something else. Now, here's the weirder truth about that. That's the postmodern truth. In that chaos at the border region, you can become, let's say, anything, right? But only certain types of configurations are stable. Only certain configurations of molecules, let's say in the subatomic sense, can exist. And the other ones don't exist. That's what the table of elements shows us, that if you don't have a particular geometric configuration and system of orbitals where energy is occupying the right spots, and the same is true for society. If you don't have a system of constant energy fluctuations and bartering and trading and interacting, that is stable from center to furthest region, the barrier at the region where things are changing, then you have collapse at some point. but it's all collapse related to that which exists beyond the most unstable layer, and that which holds true continues, right? So that's related to the proton and neutron of the core. Love God and love your neighbor, right? The two things that are bound together in the most stable form that continue on.
Well, yeah, it makes absolute sense with like the solutions to problems can only arise when there is some sort of problem arising. So, like, there was this previous Jewish state, essentially, where new elements were being added to the tradition. Things were becoming unstable.
That's me who's breaking up.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's probably me. Keep going.
Okay. I'll repeat myself, just maybe a little bit slower, just in case it is me. So,
speak slower. Your
state.
No,
within the Jewish state at around the time of Christ, or previous to him, things were becoming quite unstable with the introduction of the more secular societies kind of work their way in. If you like read the books of Maccabees, that's quite a aggressive look at just how devastating certain things were occurring, as they tend to do within.
I don't think I've read much of that, but I have read some Josephus of the time. It's rough stuff.
Yeah, and there's, without that instability within that certain amount of time, there could be no introduction to Jesus, who was a heretic and crucified for his heresy.
I don't know if you can hear me. I think. I don't know where the problem lies, but I appear to be connected still. Not that anyone's ever going to watch this, but if you are, I recommend. Oh, John dropped out. That's what it appears. Okay. All right. Well, I can't do a synopsis because I'm really not sure what they talked about. And I'm not adept at speaking with myself. I always found it a little schizophrenic, but who knows? You can learn any skill if you try hard enough. I'm not sure if it's still recording because he started it. I don't know the exact. He's back.
There we go.
Sweet.
Internet cut out for a second. Okay.
I filled the silence.
Oh, good. All right.
I got a phone call.
Okay.
I'll be right back.
I'll just try and rephrase what I was saying.
Yeah.
All right. So exactly as Tyler was saying, through that expansion of the boundary, there arises these indications that there's an instability within the foundation, and so it's like a certain group. Yes. Okay. So, like, say you have a specific group that has a certain fundamental axioms that they're holding each other to. When there's an interaction with another group, and a desire to beneficially trade with them or something like that, then they're both holding different fundamental axioms that it devalues each of the other each of the individual group's axioms to a point where things can devolve into chaos, or there can be some sort of synthesis between the two axioms into something more complete and more beneficial for this new larger group. And so in the case of, say, the introduction of paganistic thinking to the Jewish culture at around that time, there arose a need for some sort of synthesis between the two, between the pantheon of gods or of the because of the pantheon of gods, there was a devaluation essentially of individual gods to the point where you could live in a way without morals. Like it's so interesting to read Plato's Republic, because it's exactly that discussion of, is it better to live a good life or to live a bad life that it only benefits you, like a hedonistic lifestyle essentially. And it's all about Socrates attempting to make the case for why it's better to live a good life with morals. And then he kind of brings that, uses the system in place in order to kind of prove that point. And because morals are dependent upon the system in place, but in a strange kind of way, the system in place is also dependent upon the morals of the individuals that are within that system, of the culture. And it definitely raises questions within me about the separation between church and state. It may be that church is exactly one of those particulars, those specific instances of history that are useful for a specific set of people. So, like the Jewish history is entirely necessary for the Jewish culture, and when there's that introduction to the say Asian culture, that they have their own particular set of history that they hold as aspects to themselves that have shaped them into being who they are. So if you have a state that has both of those fundamental axioms that are in place, then the separation of church and state is a useful workaround for that, for sure.
I concur with that point in particular. I'm not sure historically how it relates in the conversation, but I agree with that. That one of the important concepts of the founding of the United States was the necessary discussion regarding, it wasn't really kind of indoctrinated, but the discussion of that importance amongst its founders and continually amongst our conversation now culturally. It's really, really important, because the most controlling aspects in our lives, morally speaking, or the morals of the government and the morals of our religion, whatever those are the two somewhat competing systems at the moment. And when they compete vehemently, I think we end up with this kind of progressivism versus conservatism battle, which is occurring. And that is being fomented by the constant influx of different types of culture, right, that are not integrating over a period of time. Because immigration, which is another hot topic for these days, because it's related to the race to the race interpretation of things, right? But cultures can come together all the time. In fact, they do, and they always do, because rather than destroy each other, most people operate on the good. And the good of human and primate biology, the base good, is one of barter, it seems, amongst our own particular genetic variety, right? And so most of us operate on that level. We'd rather exchange goods freely with each other. But if we inject it too quickly, right? If we infuse different cultures and then exacerbate the differences and then foment the kinds of distrust that is related to that, we get the situation that we have right now. You can't attempt to dominate one culture with another without a war, right? It has to be a conversation, which is the free exchange of packets of energy. Logos, by the way. Packets of energy in the form of words, which are the highest abstraction of our it's in order to speak a proper phrase and word, the amount of effort that you have spent throughout your life learning how to do that, right? Like that's a thing. It's found within every formulation of every word you ever utter is the history of all that effort. It's so fascinating, right? And I think that's the logos. The logos is the cultural software of structuring process, of the meta structuring process of formulating systems of cooperation at higher and higher abstractions. The word being like the ultimate abstraction of all the cooperative systems of the genes and neural structure and laryngeal tissue and vocal cords, all that cooperating to form a single note modulated with fleshy tissue in a strange cavern of ivory. It's like so weird, man. Like, why are we so weird? And nobody knows. It's just so strange. But when you really stop to think about it, it's very odd. The mushrooms have it right.
Well, if you listen to or read Yuval Harari, he goes into the reason we've been able to develop as societies is exactly through the use of abstractions and through almost fictions, exactly, in order to
narratives,
narratives of like
well-formed structures of abstractions, like
it's like money itself is an abstraction from, say, food. It's like it's a collection of food and anything else that I can buy. I can hold all of those things within this one symbol, which by itself is of little value at all.
Yeah,
it's a like a group, necessarily, but it's a group agreed upon play, like this understanding that we're pretending that this dollar, like a stack of dollars, has the ability to buy any of these other things. Anything that you can think of that is within this limit of monetary value.
Yeah.
And along with that,
there's gold, for that matter. I mean, what the hell does that have to do?
Yeah. I was reading Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley, and he goes into exactly how strange it is that people hold rubies or jewels as being valuable when they're shiny rocks. But he goes into being being so involved within the more ethereal aspects of consciousness. He goes into how these physical things are like representations of these glorified images that we hold within our own psyche, of like when we have these kind of, when going through religious experiences or mystical experiences, things like that, or even just like dreams or anything like that, there are these recurrent objects or like bright colors And so things that reflect those become valuable because they're reminders of exactly that. Of it's like a reminder of the non-physical, and he brings up exactly how this is done through many different instances, like even through like stained glass. There's this light passing through this colored piece of just simple thing, and then it's creating something mystical almost in nature or within the psyche of the individual that observes it. So
Yeah,
as
look,
yeah,
I mean,
as speaking out these eternal truths with us.
yeah, it's because it's a higher order representation of something that's occurring all the time, which is like every particle that absorbs and emits light is like a piece of stained glass that absorbs a particular amount of energy and emits at a particular frequency that says, this is what I look like having passed through the energy of a photon, right? Or being what I am at the infrared spectrum, emitting energy at this particular wavelength. Like everything's kind of saying to everything else around it, this is what I am, right? And the more beautiful the configuration, like and it's geometrically related, right? That's why the gemstone is so interesting. The lattice work of it, the hard angles, or the trapezoidal structure, or the just there's something there that speaks to fundamental natures of reality, right? Things that can't be changed, the way that angles intersect, right? You can't fight that.
Yeah, that exactly what you're saying, that this is what I am. These are things that are, hey, Sumit.
Hey, who else is there?
Hello.
It's Tyler.
Oh, Tyler,
Hello, Tyler.
I'm so happy you are here. I saw your face and I immediately, sorry, I'm late. I got occupied.
Sorry, I'm late by how many months? My own apologies, sir. It's good to see you.
It is so good to have you, Tyler. We really appreciate you here.
You've got a new picture. Definitely. You're reading a book. Turning Pro? Are you turning pro?
That's a book by Steven Pressfield. I'm a big fan of him and his books.
Cool. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't pay attention to literature very well. I should, man. People have so many good ideas. I just have so much more fun lost in thought. And I spend all my reading time on Reddit. That's a terrible admission, but I get all my news and so. Well, that's not all of it. No, that's not true. Okay, I take that back. I spend much of my time reading Reddit. But it's such a polarized lens. It's so strange. Oh.
Anyway, yeah, I was bringing up each object by existing kind of has this kind of non-verbal communication of, this is what I am. I am something to be sat upon. I'm a chair, and you can look at it from different perspectives of, like, I am a wooden material. These are different aspects of I am.
Okay. All right.
And
no, I think that's a great point. I would say that the best good, or the way that we can conceive of the greatest good, is when the thing that is being used, or the object, is in agreement with the subject, right? So when the chair says, I am a thing to be sat upon, and the subject also says, I am the thing that sits and wish to sit upon you, that is a harmonious, morally greatest situation, right? That's the good. But if a rock wishes to only be a rock and not have an ass upon it, right? Perhaps something along those lines, metaphorically speaking, and yet you desire to sit and see the rock and still sit upon it. It's a kind of a morally gray area, right? Because the rock really doesn't care about an ass sitting upon it, let's say. But if you're a slave and you're being utilized by an Egyptian to build a pyramid, and that pyramid's going to generate untold billions in tourism revenue for your country millennia down the road, how do you determine the moral good for that, right? Like, the system, if you examine it over a historical period, becomes very strange. I think that's true for a lot of circumstances, which is why it's so important that we follow the edict that we not judge so viciously, let's say. Right.
And it's interesting when you look to the original declaration of man's encounter with the infinite, the proclamation, "I am that which I am." I am essentially the nature of existence itself.
The self-determined one. I think that's how I see it. Yeah, the I am. It's like the self-determined one. And you can either be governed by the choices of your ancestors in your past, which is the biology, or you can, or you know, that's the one side of the yin. Mm-hmm. And then there's the other side of the yang, right? Or maybe those are, I have to look into that. Or how to conceptualize it, but it's that necessary ideal that you are self-governing and self-creating and being, and that the I am is it's like the perfect conceptualization of that, the meta understanding of what it is to be able to choose, let's say, because it's quite clear that we have this capacity. Although plenty of people would argue against it, right? But I mean, here's an interesting proof for the notion of free will. One of our earliest conceptions, period, any concepts before language even, it seems, is the notion of deity. That things happening in the world is caused by intent. So how the hell did that happen without intent being some like fundamental thing related to the conceptual awareness of what it is to be, right? Like, how is it that you imply or imbue intent without it being a fundamental? It's not like we reasoned our way to God, right? God is it like the notion of gods or some intent bound up in the interaction of all things. It seems to be just part of being. It's like one of our earliest attempts at abstraction, our earliest attempts at trying to talk about things is related to this concept of everything being governed by intent, be it yours or some gods or some others, right?
It seems like it could have originated just from the nature of observance of things different from yourself. So if you're two individual humans, then one of you has this idea of I am, and then the other person is acting distinct from you. Like you have no control over
you are viewing yourself with the ability to have intent and make a change in the world that you are then saying is occurring because of some other self. So how could you do that without first acknowledging it within yourself, right? And being able to do that before all abstractions, it seems, being able to recognize that inherent relationship between what it is to have self and what it is for all other things to also have self that isn't yourself. That's what I'm saying is a weird, very weird proto understanding of all things, that it seems like the cart came before the horse, right? It seems like that's something that we should have epitomized, right? That we should have come to the conclusion of, that we should have attempted to unravel. Oh my God, there's a God. Whoa! Like that should be our current technological search, right? That what is the thing that made this universe and how everything functions? And like we've just discovered it. My goodness, it's God, right? There's something that made things. Like that seems like it would be the thing that to be discovered last, not the thing that's discovered first. That's so odd, that concept of infinity and infinite intent and oddness. It's yeah. Anyhow, I don't want to derail further, but
Hey,
I really don't know what all was discussed, and I get so worried that I just will go.
no, I mean, we've been going over exactly the same types of things that we were going over before.
Okay.
And let's see. I suppose we can touch on the subject of conscience, because that seems like very much the development of morality, especially. Just such a kind of strange imposition upon our own genetics and our own lives to have something that goes against or like tells us in its own nonverbal way when to do things, or not necessarily when to do things, but like the repercussions of things if we're to follow through with them.
Right. Yes. I think it's
and
really
then
important.
And then a little "told you so" directly afterwards.
Yeah. Only if you really want to get the barb in, man. Why does that sting so much? Why do we hate that, right? Mm.
So it seems to me, at least, that our conscience could be kind of like our own genetic intent speaking towards our more conscious side. So, like, the reason we've been able to develop and adapt so well is because we've kind of been able to forego our own genetic desires in order to like get other things done that could benefit those genetic desires into like the future in a better way. And then it's almost like we've lost that kind of connection within our genetic propensity to follow through with what we're supposed to be doing, and like that's kind of left us aimless with our own lives, of not sure how to, like we've in today's culture we've been stripped of all of the oughts that we've had throughout time, so we're stuck in kind of a place of is with science. All there is.
It's not even that, man. It's masquerading as confidence, right? But it's a whole system of contradictory oughts and an inundation of them, right? It's everyone clamoring for their own moral ought system to be distinct from everyone else's, and yet also the supreme pinnacle view, right? And that only the few who agree with you are worthy of interacting with you, and that it's creating this terrible dynamic flux, right, where like ever increasing amounts of energy are being distributed between the groups. To be non-abstract is the protests and such, and the violence is going to continue to ramp up. And if you look further afield from the United States, you're seeing it far more, seriously in other lands and other cultures. This ramping up of a clash of energies and ideas and attempts to cement your beliefs in the wider culture around you. It's in the war of ideas, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's vital that we understand that the moral structure that we can all agree upon is one, the greatest good is that which is the most meta ethic that incorporates the most number of people in the most harmonious configuration, and yet understands that it's the individual's, whatever the individual is, right, attempt to choose that produces it. And
yeah,
I was there.
Uh-huh. Well, it's funny how it seems like there's two different ways of trying to reach that greatest good. and there's kind of the Platonic idea that there's always something better. Maybe I don't necessarily understand the Platonic idea as much, but like that all that we are currently are not as good as what good could be, and so we must seek out what that greater good is. And then there's the Aristotelian kind of notion of good, that it's built out of all of these smaller individual things that work. So like we can look backwards in time at all of the major characters within history of how they've affected change for the better by our own future or like not recognition, but by our own future definitions of like looking back to what brought us to this position that we deem as good versus who brought us to a position that we deem like people in the Great Depression. They don't see the people the introduction of however that came about as those individuals are good peoples because they've put them into a place that they'd rather not be in. And so it's like looking backwards in time to the people that have gotten us to certain positions that we prefer to be in rather than the opposite. And what's it? So yeah, I guess there's kind of two different ways of trying to locate the good. But hold on one second. All right, so I got to leave in like 30 minutes or so. But I think the last real major point was our discussion on conscience within yesterday's conversation. And from my own understanding, I can relate the unconscious driving of our actions, and I can place that along with the conscience that we have. But it's kind of different from that because there's certain unconscious drivings behind our conscious mind that are taking us towards more short-term gains. But there's the conscience, which is kind of like the better version of our unconscious mind that is attempting to drive us towards more long-term gains within the future. Like you have the understanding that if I eat ice cream, like I have my own biology that's craving ice cream, and then there's also the conscience within you that tells you in 5 years you could be much more attractive if you were to work out every day for 5 years. And it's like we have these two contradictory kind of selves of the short-term seeking self and then the long-term seeking self. And then there's also the kind of conscious element that's having to choose between those two. And how I see. Okay, no, go ahead. I have
I think it's the orientation of the present, right? And consciousness is awareness. One component of it is awareness, and the other component of it is choice. And the choice consists of do more of something or do less of something, or wait. That's it. Like that's it. When it all gets boiled down to it, that's it. It's add energy into something, take away energy from something, or wait. And the waiting part is essentially just saying, I will let all the other decide for me with their own multitudinous intentions and decisions, right? We'll see if there's a better configuration that I will like, right? That's like rolling the dice. That's the randomness element of choice, I guess, is the waiting. Yeah, but
Yeah.
the consciousness is the harmonious reorientation of whatever you're aware of. So that awareness component is what matters. So if you are aware of your life as the current configuration and you make decisions, right? That's the good. And if you're more aware of the future and the future configurations, and you're even more aware further of what it means to orient yourself in a positive way towards those, that's the better and the best, right? That's that more morally sound, more morally good reasoning. And if it's transferable to others, then you got a religion, right? Like that's how it's been working. Well, what's the best religion? Like that's the idea that we've always been discussing between amongst each other. What's the best religion? What's the best whole system?
Mm-hmm. Well, even consciousness itself is such a strange thing as well, because there's like, in order to function in the world, you have to have a very small window of consciousness to focus yourself on entirely what is like necessary at a time. But there's instances where, like through the use of psychedelics or other actions that can bring us to a kind of more fuller awareness of the world around us, to the point that you can't even necessarily act at all. Like reading Dose of Perception, Aldous Huxley spends like 40 minutes looking at a chair and just describing the intricacies and the connectedness between it.
Yeah.
And it's like his door of perception was blasted open to the point where everything was emitting this infinite aspect of itself
in the visual spectrum.
The observer.
Yeah, in the visual spectrum. So this is the thing. Like he was acting. He was acting by being the observer. He was acting by looking. Right? He could have closed his eyes. He could have looked elsewhere. He could have listened to sounds. He could have had psychedelic-inspired abstract thoughts at different levels. But yeah, he was in fact choosing, and that's what's so interesting about psychedelics is kind of the infinite. It kind of reverts you to being a child. Everything becomes wondrously interesting again, right? And that's yeah, it's fascinating stuff. I don't want to go down that road too far, but I actually think that psychedelic drug use can be used medicinally. So in theology, the study of using it as a kind of medicine, and what used to be shamanic and rite of passage type stuff in older cultures, and still is in many places, has extraordinary benefits for certain kinds of people in certain circumstances, related to the neurogenerative and neuroprotective things that need to happen within a brain to configure itself in an efficient manner, right? Like epileptics have problems with the propagation of electrical signals because of a misconfiguration of their neurons, or expression of a particular gene that doesn't function quite properly in neurotransmitters, or yeah. So there's
through the use of those psychedelics, there's the inherent loss of self within those. The ego death.
Ego death. Yeah.
Self. Yeah, that occurs to the point where it's like you lose your inherent value structures that you have, and you're merely observing, or you're like taking in all these things without filtering it through that conscious filter of like biological needs.
Right.
Kind of.
I would use lots of people say ego death or a loss of self. I've never experienced that. What I instead seem to experience is an identification with greater than what I currently or in the past identified with, right? And my own past use. That's how I perceived it. It wasn't that it was a loss of self. It was that I was wholly mistaken about what I thought myself was. That the connections between things were far more grand and intricate and real than this kind of narrow band of perception that you have when you constrict it to simply, just this handful of human needs that you pass through the day and only stare at yourself in the mirror. And, our language ends up becoming so personalized and ego driven. Yeah, I think we need to change our language. We need to change our perception of religion. We need to change our moral arguments.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm currently writing something that is almost a naturalistic case for the personal relation with the God image within our heads, and I'm doing so via the conscience, which I see very much as we kind of have our unconscious mind that is viewing the world exactly as it is, without being filtered by our conscious mind, which is driven by our own self desires, things like that. And there's certain instances where you can almost communicate with the unconscious self that has a greater deal of information that hasn't yet been filtered via, and it's like it's filtered into the one hemisphere of our brain and then pushed into our conscious mind, so that I'm a person thinking these things or something like that. There's I think this author Rick Strassman. I've heard him speak a bit about DMT, the spirit molecule, and how he's attempted to point out how the prophets of old, and not just like those who prophesy of the future, but those intermediaries between God and the children of Israel, that they are those that have been on the outskirts and kind of passed through many different positions. Such like Peterson brings this up in one of his lectures, that Moses, prior to having the experience on the mountain and then coming down with the 10 rules for life, he's put in his 10,000 hours essentially of being the communicator with the people, of each of them coming in with their own specific problems one at a time, and then Moses having to like deal with all of them. And after that, he has a wider understanding of the people within the group, all of the problems that have arisen between each of them. So, and how they're...
I don't know. I would actually argue that Moses was not aware of that. In fact, suffered from a type of blindness related to that. And I think I think that's something that they're attempting to portray in the literature, it seems, related to. Okay, well, so he was a bad communicator to begin with. He got his brother Aaron to speak for him. He was a speaker, in fact, because he was so bad at speaking, worried he couldn't even speak to anybody about anything. And then, in fact, he later on discussed the partitioning of responsibilities amongst captains of 10 and 150, whatever, all that, right? So he was adept, I think, at organizing and structuring, but he did not understand certain concepts. So there was the incident of coming down with the law and smashing the tablets and then going back up for more. I'd say that's a fairly fundamental misunderstanding of what was going on there, right? Maybe, but he later on also claimed some miracle for his own or something, and for that reason was not allowed to enter into the land of Canaan. So there's some limitations to his character, and I think that's really important in the Judaic culture and in general to note those limitations. But I think they're important too.
Oh yeah, it's brought up directly in that story too, because his wife called him a bringer of blood because he neglected his responsibilities with his own children by not acting, by not dealing with the circumcision, which was very much a part of their culture for that, for them. And so he was too, well, yeah, because
he was too removed from the people in some sense. He was too removed from the people and too removed from the kind of concept of administration that he needed to understand. At least that's what the moral lesson was with God punishing him for not entering the land of Canaan, I think was.
Well, that in that instance, it was him taking on his own action as being the bringer of, like being that savior for humanity instead of doing so. It's like him smashing the rock brings forth water when God told him to speak to the rock so that water will burst forth from it. It was like Moses put himself in a higher position than the nature of reality.
And his language even is he used the personal pronoun "I brought forth this water," right? And that's I think that's an important distinction because it's failing to meet what later Christ would say is the first law of heaven, that you love God with all your heart, might, mind, and strength. It sets the people up for failure because as long as you're looking at a particular instantiation of genetic, existence, namely the individual Moses, then you're going to fail when he dies, right? Machiavelli noted that in The Prince and the subsequent generations of rulers, and the way that you have this weird cycle of good ruler and bad ruler and all related to just the failure of genes to propagate solely on their own the type of intention that you need for good leadership. And I think that's bound up in that illuminated error, that illuminated flaw that is pointed out purposefully. I at least that's how I've kind of seen it.
Well, I guess what I was trying to bring towards was the certain archetype or the certain type of figure that is that prophet of God. And so that in the case of, say, Nathan and David, David was the king who acted towards his own beneficial, like he saw something he wanted or someone he wanted, and he committed the actions to partake in that. Whereas Nathan is the lowliest. Johnathan Haidt brings this up quite a bit about those that are on the outskirts of society are the ones that have a better understanding of the repercussions, I think.
They have the outside perspective of whatever your system is colliding into or about to collide into, be it the future in the prophetic sense, or a current political collision that's occurring. I guess it's all prophetic in some sense because a warning is necessarily indicates that it's going to be in the future. So it's either like a proximal prophecy or a distal one. So,
so like Moses was somebody that at least had that knowledge brought to him. He was an observer and a kind of judge for the people of Israel, and like so much that they had so many problems that they were all coming to him. It was only until he went up to the mountain, kind of lost himself in a way, so that he could, through that period of 40 days, 40 nights, that he can get a more clear understanding and a solution that can be brought back down to the people.
Right.
And it's kind of this future or secular perspective that I know like Joe Rogan has, that it was all done consciously, as like Moses had this understanding, okay, I can write down these laws for the people, and then that'll just fix things. Like I'll be the new ruler of the people. But the nature of encounters with the infinite seem very much non-egoistic, which Rogan himself should necessarily know, I'd imagine. But he has a very pessimistic viewpoint of religion in general. Brett Weinstein brings up an interesting point to him through in that same kind of capacity that the Catholic Church has a system for dealing with that, where there's the box where people confess their sins to the priest. And if you have a tightly knit community, all of them kind of professing their sins to the priest can use that knowledge to structure a sermon to preach to the people in that community in a way that can aid them and benefit them for changing their behavior.
Right.
And by doing so, even though
you can also take advantage of them and further the corruption.
Exactly. But that's kind of why there's this loss of I don't know if it's necessarily beneficial, but it's kind of like the priest's structure is intentionally physically beneficial by having celibate priests and nuns. Their focus is more upon the success of the group around them rather than their own self, because if the group around them is successful, then being a tithe-based system, the church also is successful, and so their way of life is also beneficial for themselves. Right. Okay, I guess I have to go now, but I think it's interesting how Jordan Peterson, after being a clinical psychologist, has come to has brought about his own 12 rules for life, and especially when reading like the prologue to that book, how it's very much a dialogue between his own unconscious mind, and you can tell it's kind of his own mind because
actually.
Okay. Well, he does. It's very much kind of an internal dialogue between himself, and it's like expressing things to him that he knows to be true in the same way that Peterson like expresses things to other people that they already know to be true as well. And it's like our own mind has gathered all this information, and once it tells us this, like in the cases of dreams even, it's like we know it to be true because we've already lived it, and we can remember back to where these new conclusions have come from.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, it requires a host of observations that not everyone have made, but certainly the people attracted to Peterson have a sort of lived experience that he's speaking to. Yeah.
So if you can like find a person that has been on the outskirts of society and seen a multitude of problems, and then put them into a religious encounter, either with their own unconscious mind, and like where all of these problems have kind of like amalgamated together to try to come up with some sort of solution, in the same way that like when mice go through a maze over and over, or go through a maze and then they dream about exactly that maze to try to figure out how to solve it faster. It's like the act of losing oneself, just as you are when you're dreaming, allows you to formulate those conclusions or those expressions of solutions to problems. Good. I have to go. I'm not sure if either of you have the capability to stop the broadcast yourself by maybe... Anyway.
Hey, I'm not sure if you started. That's a good question. I really haven't played around with this, other than starting it up a couple times.
I would imagine you would have to be signed into the one of the Jordan Peterson
account.
accounts. Yeah.
I mean, you can discontinue it. We can.
Okay. Yeah.
I can chat off air if he wants to talk. Okay.
Oh yeah. Okay, so anyway, this has been the Jordan Peterson Study Group conversation recap. So if you would like to take part in these types of conversations, then go to jordanbpeterson.community, and that has the host of links for all of the different facilities, or not facilities, but the times and locations and topics that we go through. So yeah. pleasure talking with you, Tyler, and Sumit also. I'm sorry you didn't get to speak as much, but
Good to see you again, man.
yeah. Anyway, I gotta go.
Have a good day.
See ya.